So my name is Jyotis James. I'm a PhD candidate at Texas A&M University in the Department of Philosophy. My research interests are in critical race theory and anti-colonialism. And today I'm going to be moderating a panel about casteism and its relations to anti-Blackness. So let me introduce our panelists, Sonja Thomas, um, Thenmozhi Soundararajan, and Seema Hari. And just a second. So we're going to begin with Professor Sonja Thomas, who is an associate professor of women and gender and sexuality studies at Colby College. Her research examines the intersections of caste, race, gender, and religion in Kerala. And she also does research with race and settler colonialism and immigration of South Asian priests to rural America. She's the author of Privileged Minorities, Syrian Christianity, Gender and Minority Rights in Post-Colonial India. And she has also written articles on education and religious minorities in India and on Black vernacular traditions in the US and globally. So Professor Thomas, go ahead and you can begin.
Thank you for having me on this really important panel. I'm very excited to join my two panelists here and Jyotis for moderating, but also that the Malayali community is talking about anti-Blackness in our community. It's really just about time. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about terms, and especially terms that are familiar to Malayalees, and also to talk about issues of racialized discrimination in Kerala and amongst Kerala migrants in the diaspora, and especially amongst dominant caste or those with caste privilege. So I'm going to share my screen just a little bit so we can just go over some terms so we're all on the same page. 1 second. So these are some terms that I've made for Malayalees to kind of get our minds around what we're talking about when we talk about caste. Some terms that we use. Dalit is a word that means broken or downtrodden, and it's a word used for the former untouchable castes. Gandhi called Dalits Harijans, so you might have heard this word, which is actually really paternalistic. Harijan means people of God, and so Dr. B.R. Ambedkar rejects this term to use the term Dalit, the father of the Indian Constitution. In Kerala, we tend to use caste-specific terms. So you might, if you are a first-generation Malayali, you might have heard the terms Pulaya or Parayan. For second-generation and third-generation Malayalis, we might be familiar with the term Pariah because it's one of the only Malayali terms that has made it into the English language, and it comes from a Dalit caste in Kerala. Both the Pulayan and the Parayans castes in Kerala were formerly slaves in Kerala because Kerala had such abusive caste system practices and still to this day does. You might have heard this term Bahujan. It means majority. It refers to non-dominant caste Sudra peoples. In India, oftentimes Bahujan peoples are called other backwards classes or OBCs. In Kerala, you might have heard the caste names like Erjaba or Tia. Also, Latin Christians and Muslims in Kerala fall within the OBC category. Dalit Bahujan is a term that refers to the shared experiences between Dalit peoples and Bahujan peoples. In Kerala, you might hear instead just commonly called low caste. And I'm going to talk a little bit in just a second about why it's problematic to use low caste. Another term you might have heard is Adivasi. It means original inhabitant or tribal peoples of India. In the Indian Constitution, Adivasis and Dalits are combined together, and you might hear them together as the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, or SCST. Dominant caste refers to those who have caste privilege. The term is preferred by Dalit activists because it shows that those with caste privilege also wield caste power. In Kerala, you might have heard the term upper caste or forward caste used by the Kerala state. And you can see how forward caste is really set against other backwards classes. The majority, so just to say some of the dominant caste names in Kerala, Nambudri Brahmin, Nair, and Syrian Christians are all considered dominant caste. The majority of Indians in the United States are dominant caste, and the majority of Malayalees in the United States are dominant caste. Many Malayali Christians come from the St. Thomas Christian or Syrian Christian background, which is the group of Christians that I study. So you might have heard their specific church names like Syro-Malabar Catholic, Canaan, Jacobite, Orthodox. These Christians believe that they were Brahmins when they were converted, and they do not receive the affirmative action policy called reservations in India, so they're considered to be dominant caste. Caste activists reject the terms upper and lower because upper implies superiority and lower really demeans Dalit Bahujan peoples. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen just for a second and come back to what I study a lot of, which is racialized discrimination in India. I study caste, but I also study the intersections of casteism with racism in Kerala, and especially how there's still casteism in the United States. One of the things that I've seen a lot when we're talking about Black Lives Matter in Malayali communities and South Asian communities is there's an impetus to compare casteism with racism and the effects of casteism as similar to the effects of racism, which is true because both of these forms of discrimination are called descent-based. It matters who your parents are. So if you grew up or were raised in the United States, you might have heard of the one-drop rule, which is like it matters who your parents are, right? So the effects of racism are similar to the effects of casteism. But one of the things I argue in a lot of the research that I do is that we tend then also to separate it, to think wrongly that casteism only happens in India and that racism only happens in the United States, which is not the case. There is racism against Sindhi populations in Ethiopian population that has lived in India and Pakistan for generations, for hundreds of years. There's discrimination in Kerala against Northeast Indians that is purely racialized discrimination. And in Kerala, there's also a lot of discrimination against those who are perceived to be darker. In Kerala, you might hear the term Dravidian used against those with upper caste or dominant caste privilege that we often use the term Aryan. I don't think people are running around calling themselves Aryan or Dravidian on a day-to-day basis in Kerala, but there are assumptions that we make based on caste that, especially from dominant caste communities, you assume that a certain caste does a particular type of labor. The Pulayan and the Parayan caste, the Dalit caste, were once considered slaves in Kerala. So to do agricultural work versus to be a landlord, you assume things about people who are out in the sun doing a particular type of work with particular type of features. So when in our Malayali community, when we talk about, I just prefer fair skin, or I just don't want to be karambi, like dark skin, how these words themselves that we use are tied up in our own notions of casteism. So when we have the diaspora in the United States, like I mentioned, the vast majority of Malayalees and Malayali Christians in the United States are of a particular caste. Often we don't have conversations about this in dominant caste communities. That's because when you have privilege, you don't need to talk about it. And we've seen this with Black Lives Matter, that white people don't have to have a conversation with their children about issues of police brutality because it doesn't happen to them. And so Black people might have a very different conversation with their children about the police. So we might not talk about caste in dominant caste Malayali enclaves in the United States, but you might hear these terms like, don't go outside because you'll get dark, garambi. You know, like, and how these terms are tied up in casteism that we may not talk about. So I'm just gonna leave it there with some terms, with those terms and some things that I've discussed about racialized discrimination. Turn it back over to our moderator, Jyotis.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. And thank you for outlining the specific caste as it's used in Malayalam and where it translates over to certain ideas about caste many Americans may have been taught through their schooling. And I think you brought up a great distinguishing point where in Kerala, people specifically mention the specific caste name. They don't just say Dalit or lower caste, whatever it may be, but there's a specific caste name that's used, and sometimes there are caste names that are used as slurs and used to demean each other in the Malayalam language. I'm not going to use it here, but it's very apparent when people do employ them. But giving that outline and then showing how Syrian Christians and Malayalees generally who migrate here tend to be from privileged castes outlines how that plays into economic resources and the negotiations that are done so. So thank you for that, and we will return to that shortly. But let me introduce our next panelist, Seema Hari. So Seema Hari is a software engineer, a model, and activist. And as a model, Seema uses her career to represent dark-skinned Indians in the modeling industry and break the stigma around dark skin. So Seema, if you would like to tell us a bit more about your history and how you got into advocacy and your migrant experience, that would be great.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me on this panel. I'm so happy and honored to be on this panel with all of you. Yeah, my experience is that I was born and raised in Bombay, or Mumbai as it's known now, in Maharashtra, but my parents are both from Kerala. And so growing up as a Malayali from Kerala in Bombay in a predominantly North Indian, Gujarati neighborhood was already a big burden to bear, because I, first of all, looked very different from all of them. So I was very dark skinned. So I grew up around all light skinned kids. And, you know, just because of my skin color, I've been, you know, harassed and ridiculed since day one. Like some of my earliest memories are just about, you know, traumatizing times when kids called me names, and even their mothers and teachers and adults participating in colorism and calling me all kinds of names and things because of that. So all my life, I've carried around this burden of being dark skinned and being ridiculed about it, not just at a surface level, physical appearance level thing. It was much more demeaning than that. It was always about, you know, how, you know, if I didn't change myself, I wouldn't find somebody to love, or nobody would marry me, because the practice of arranged marriage is still pretty common in India. You know, my relatives would always come and tell my mom and dad that, you know, why aren't you fixing her? You know, nobody from our community would want to marry a girl like that. So all of that has been really damaging to me. So my journey has been one of, you know, where I've completely hated myself and been driven to depression and suicide because of the rampant colorism in India. And then somehow finding my way out of that depression and realizing that, you know, melanin is actually a superpower, and melanin allows me to, you know, do all these things that I love doing, being outside, being outdoors, and being adventurous. And slowly realizing as I move through the world, you know, how colorism is also not just an Indian problem. It's a worldwide issue. It's a global issue. I moved from India to China, and I went there and I thought everyone was light skinned, but they were all also applying whitening creams to become some kind of pinkish white. So they also held on to these like white supremacist ideals of beauty, where they wanted to become exactly pinkish white and not, you know, the shade of light skin that they were. So I realized that even though in other parts of the world, colorism may not be as rampant, but it still affects people's daily lives, and especially women's perceptions of their own beauty. And I studied engineering, and then that's how I got to move to China. I was, you know, pursued a software engineering career, and that led me to China. And then I came to the US to start my master's. I did a postgraduate program in around basically like UX design and product management. And when I came here, I realized, you know, that was actually a big turning point in my life when I realized, you know, how Black women here especially celebrated their skin color, and, you know, really inspired me to see the beauty in, you know, dark skin. And I realized that even though I always loved you know, people with dark skin, and I always found them beautiful, I had somehow internalized the colorism to myself in my self-image. I found my, dark skin ugly, and I had to, actively work on that to get out of that. So now that I've reached this place of like ultimate self-acceptance, and I love my dark skin and I love everything about myself, I somehow stumbled into modeling. A makeup artist asked me to, that she had never practiced or doing makeup on dark skin, and she was ashamed of it. And that's why she wanted to practice on my dark skin. And I was so not used to hearing any of that, and so used to just being ridiculed on the streets every single day of my life, that I immediately said yes, even though I had still had so many self-esteem issues to work through, and I hated being in front of the camera. But I still had to say yes, because I believe that, if I said no to that opportunity, I'm just validating everybody's belief that, dark skinned people don't deserve to be in front of the camera. So once I stumbled into that, I was coincidentally after that moving to LA, and then everyone I met in LA would look at my Facebook when I became friends with them and think that I'm a model, but I was actually an engineer. And then they would just be so surprised, and then they would say, you should meet my friend who's a designer or a model, and just put me in touch. So I've been trying to focus all my energy, because I have a full-time job as a software engineer, and I love that job. So with my modeling, my whole goal is to just understand and deconstruct how colorism has been perpetuated throughout the world, and especially in South Asian communities. And then also show people how all these issues are kind of interlinked, about how even my caste, I am from a lower caste, as we are from the Mukua community in Kerala, and we've been called the lower caste, but I now understand how we should be calling ourselves the Dalit-Bahujans. And all my life I've been also taught to hide my caste. So I've been taught to not mention where I come from. I've been taught to also not mention the place that I come from, because as soon as you mention my native place, it gives away my caste. So even navigating Malayali spaces in Bombay, we were always taught to just somehow be generic and erase my caste, and never have that discussion with anybody else. So I found that always, something about myself that I had to hide. And slowly coming here and realizing how, if you don't name that problem, and if you don't, you can't fight it, and you can't actually, the shame that is associated with is because of the oppression. I've started realizing that, I have to, talk about my caste, and I have to, own it, and talk about how, I'm not ashamed of being from that caste. It was not my responsibility that I was born into this caste. And, I'm not ashamed of my people, working hard and doing manual labor for centuries to get where we are right now. And I've definitely, even in modern social circles, even in education, even through college, and, through the tech circles, heard about people talking about their caste in a very, exclusive fashion, about, especially dominant caste people bragging about their customs and talking about what they do. And also people from the Bahujan caste having the same feeling as me about having to hide their caste and not accidentally getting outed with their employers, especially when the employers are, huge employers of H-1B visas, or they work in teams that are super homogeneously distributed, again, with upper caste Hindus or dominant caste Hindus. So I have been, through my experience of talking about caste, I've found, people who reach out to me via DMs and share their stories with me. And I've realized that, because we are not allowed, this is held against us in so many ways, and we're not allowed to talk about it. That shame is actually keeping us from progressing, and shame is actually, helping the dominant caste perpetuate their supremacy. So I've been trying to talk about, all the work that actually Thenmozhi and Equality Labs does about, educating people about casteism, and how that is even rampant today in all the, the surveys that Equality Labs has done about showing that even in employment in, one of the most liberal, forward-thinking places, you would think, like Silicon Valley, people are discussing their caste. And also how, people inadvertently, even when they think of, just perpetuating their customs, they, by including only people who participate in those customs, they're excluding people who don't belong to that caste. And there are all these subtle ways that casteism is still perpetuated, and all these not so subtle ways also. Like, for example, in arranged marriage, there are so many people who have reached out to me, and even in my own life, where I have to fight to get married to an upper caste person, and my relationship to an upper caste person is deemed unworthy or illegal because I'm from a lower caste. So it's been unpacking all of that, and then my journey has been trying to personalize that and tell my personal story, because I realize that people think that it's not an issue because they're not hearing about it. And I've realized that people just think that it's some fringe issue on the side that doesn't affect anybody. But by telling my own personal story, I've realized that people can see that it's a real thing and it's affecting people to this day. So that's what I've been focused on doing through my platform. And I've also realized that, people talk about how, like, why do you care about anti-Blackness so much? Is it because you're dark skinned? And I think that also somehow needs to change, because I just care about human rights, and it doesn't matter, like, if these people look like me or don't look like. It's not about that. It's about, I know how these social structures are used to oppress people, and I see that reflected in other societies and other cultures, and I can recognize that. I can recognize feeling like an outcast. I can recognize feeling ashamed about characteristics about my own self. So but just also educating the people that follow me that if you take a person from India like me, like if you were just born in India and lived there all your life, and you transport them the next day to America, even if they are not taught about race, even if they are not taught about anything, any external factors, the day they arrive, just by the practices that they were taught about casteism and just by colorism that is rampant in India, they will by default be subscribing to anti-Blackness, because that's what our systems taught us. So just telling my followers, or like people who are connected to me, educating them about these are the systems, and like how they are interconnected, and how they all somehow, like, under the layers feed each other, and just trying to unpack that in my own life as well, like in ways in which I've internalized things, and ways in which I'm subscribing to these systems of oppression. So my journey has been just being honest about all of that stuff, and then hoping that people recognize themselves in my personal story, or find empathy, because someone close to them has gone through the same thing, and not thinking about it as some other person's issue, and that constant othering that happens with all these systems of oppression. So yeah, that's my story so far.
Thank you so much, Seema. I really do have to commend you. I'm doing a bit of research on dark skin and aesthetics around that. So what looks good on dark skin? And one of the hardest things related to that was finding South Asians, or representative South Asians who are dark skinned. And it took me a while to dig through. And if you do a Google search, you're not going to find anything related to India and dark skin in a position where the beauty of the person is magnified. And I primarily had to look into the Black diaspora, the African diaspora, and Australia among those populations to find dark-skinned models and representatives of beauty and grandeur. And to be able to find you, I only came upon your page about a few weeks ago, and it was through Malayalees for Black Lives Matter. But through this, you're creating a network, and you're showing dark-skinned people, not just here in the United States among the South Asian diaspora, but also in South Asia and maybe the African diaspora, the Caribbean diaspora, that it is possible to be dark-skinned and excel in beauty. And I think your presence there alone challenges a lot of the stereotypes of what can be considered beautiful and breaks those historical narratives. And thank you for speaking about your experience, especially connecting it back to the fact that casteism does carry over, even in a place like the Silicon Valley, where people would think it's progressive liberal in California, but the attitudes that we import from India are still preserved.
Yeah, and
so
also,
thank you. Go ahead.
And also one thing I forgot to mention is, like, most of the slurs that I don't want to mention here, most of the slurs that I was called on the streets in Bombay and that followed me around through my teenage years were, casteist slurs. And, people just, by looking at me, assumed my caste and, called me those slurs. And I am from the Bahujan caste, so they were right. But that assumption itself is, shows you that how much work needs to be done, and you know, how far down the path, you know, we need to go. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done.
Thank you for that. So let's then move on to our final panelist, Thenmozhi Soundararajan. And Thenmozhi is a Dalit-American artist, technologist, and executive director of Equality Labs, an art and technology startup supporting South Asian religious, cultural, and genderqueer communities in the United States and South Asia. Through her work, she organizes communities to fight impunity, state violence, anti-Blackness, caste apartheid, and religious intolerance. Her work has been recognized by the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, Producers Guild of America Diversity Program, the Museum of Contemporary Art, and Magnum Foundation. So, Thenmozhi, go ahead and tell us about your history, your experience within the United States, and the activism that you've been heavily involved in bringing Dalit concerns to the forefront in the United States.
Can you hear me? Okay. Jai Beam and Jai Savitri, everybody. It's really a wonderful thing to be here, to be able to have some of these conversations, because these are conversations that are a long time coming in the diaspora. And, you know, to be honest, as someone who is caste oppressed, it's been, years of really fighting the caste hegemonies that silence not only Dalit people, but also perpetuate anti-Blackness that our community performs like routinely across the nation. And, you know, in terms of really bringing it back to our conversation about Malayalees for Black lives or South Asians for Black lives, the call here from caste oppressed people is for people to do their own work and figure out their own shit. Like, it's 2020. At this point, the fact that we're still having to tell people to confront their own casteism is really a failure of people really taking on their own education and not recognizing the harm that brown communities play in being a model minority reformist roadblock when it comes to issues of policing and abolition. And so, you know, I feel like there is a really powerful panel that we should really do after this that could just be Dalit activists who are from, Kerala, that can speak to, you know, the mess of caste atrocity that's happening there, that I'm happy to help coordinate because I know lots of Malayalees who really struggle with the casteism within the Malayali cultural context. But I think part of what I want to focus on is really that, you know, in a lot of ways, like the reticence for our community to even discuss our own problems have meant innumerable harm to many of our Black and Indigenous and immigrant brothers and sisters. Because, you know, other folks might be asking for police abolition, but our folks will go and take a picture with the police. Or our domestic violence organizations will go forward and do a PSA with the police. And we're willing to be a diversity equity partner in the table doing cultural competency work while other people are being murdered in the street by the police. So those choices are so embedded in terms of the graded inequality of caste, because an anti-Dalit mindset really fits really easily into an anti-Black mindset. And so many of those reformist behaviors come from the ways people silence and shudder the conversation of caste apartheid. And, you know, every hour we see 3 Dalits murdered, 2 that are raped, and 3 houses that are burnt. And throughout my work in the diaspora, the thing that I could not really reconcile was knowing the massive amount of atrocities that were happening in India and watching our diaspora be completely silent. And I've had people practice untouchability on me here in the diaspora. I've had professors say caste was not really that significant and that I should focus on class, and that there was no significant Dalit leaders to be considering or looking at. And even the erasure of Dalit leaders from the ways that we understand South Asian history. So I remember there was a significant exhibition about South Asian Americans, and I talked to the curator because they had not a single Dalit in that curation. And I was like, why wouldn't you include Dr. Ambedkar? He's like one of the first Indians to go to an Ivy League school. He wrote the damn Indian Constitution. Why is he not there? And they were like, oh, but we have Gandhi. And I think that's part of what I want to show, is that we have a systemic erasure and culture of impunity that all South Asian networks feed into. And I think the job of Malayalees for Black Lives is to just rigorously rip the truth out, talk about all the ugly, dark corners of our, of our communities that are doing this crap. And also invite a new way of being an intercaste and interfaith relationship with each other. And I think that that takes a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of humility, and it takes a lot of listening. And if you think about all of the South Asian events that you've been to, I can guarantee you've not been to a session that's had 2 Dalits on it, let alone all Dalit panels. And this is part of the reasons why, when this abolitionist, this uprising began, I had a challenge to organizations saying, what if you had a year where only the people that you brought to the table were caste oppressed and religious minorities from your communities? How would the conversations about anti-Blackness and how we show up change? Because oftentimes when we don't have oppressed people talking with oppressed people to define the terms, the arguments of what our movements look like end up becoming very superficial exchanges about, appropriation or ways that we find ourselves in the experiences of Black communities, but not looking at our own role of how we often oppress other people within our spaces. And so I think that's a really important call for self-reflection. And this is also a reason why I said that we need less influencers and more organizers. Because to be an organizer means to be in principled struggle with other people in your community that are doing that truth building work, where they're like, oh, this is happening, but you know what, let's use radical love and let's build power. Let's build a movement that can take this on. And that's a lot harder to do than a social media post. But when you do that work, we actually create the power that can sustain and flank Black movements for liberation, but also commit to a radical caste abolitionist politic. Because the reality is that every single person in the diaspora is culpable for the genocide that's happening right now in India, because upper caste networks in the United States help to fund the rise of Hindu nationalism. And that rise is really one of upper caste power, flexing its stage on the global, stage, and supporting the erosion of democracy. And we have a really critical role to play, I think, in the 2020 elections, because Trump is going to look to weaponizing upper caste Hindu votes to vote for Trump versus voting going blue. And I think that we have to consider, again, what are the ways that our community has learned to be reformist roadblocks on the issues of caste, and how can we dismantle the ways then we show up and repeat those patterns around issues of Black struggle? And that's work you guys need to think about in terms of how you've seen and understand the Malayali community perpetuating and being supportive of anti-Black policies and structures. The other thing which I also wanted to just kind of name is that, in this really vital moment, I think that we have to be ambitious about what liberation looks like. Too often, I think brown communities play a very transactional model of solidarity, where we want to show up for people's protests, but we're not willing to do the work of what is needed to actually look at a co-liberation model. What are we willing to give up in terms of privilege? What do we need to think about in terms of investing in actual, transformative justice, community safety models? And it might mean that we are in, economic reparations relationships with communities that have been oppressed, whether they're Black or Shivi or Dalit. But I also think that it really requires a commitment to to go to that edge of where you don't know what you don't know. And I think the confidence of upper caste people to theorize and to keep naming and holding space at a time when they've been complicit with so much violence is utterly ludicrous. And this is part of the reasons why I think there were so many Dalit Bahujans that were just doing so, you know, we're just like completely eye rolling when we saw a lot of people virtue signaling about Black Lives Matter, because these people hadn't even done the basic work to unlearn their own caste privilege. And that's why that, you know, for us to really do the meaningful work of being the strong allies that are needed to flank Black movements for liberation, we have to do more political education. We've got to unlearn like our anti-Blackness and our anti-Dalitness, and we have to show up when it matters. And that doesn't mean just in protest. It means thinking about ways that you support candidates that are about getting out white supremacist power out of office. It means also being really a critical analysis about like who are the brown Uncle Toms that are coming up that basically carry the water, not just for white supremacists, but also for Hindu nationalists. If you give me a list of Indian candidates that are running for the office, how many of them are saying, you know, we will be Democrat, but we are also playing with the Hindu nationalists at this table. And what people are forced to say is, well, we want someone in office, we got to vote blue, but you know, if they are connected with Hindu nationalists, oh well. And I think that when we say that, oh well, or when we shy away from the discomfort of being able to redraw the political terrain to one of liberation as opposed to reform, we ourselves are participating in a politics of complicity. And when we have seen so many of our people die this year, when we have seen our homeland descend into genocide, we deserve to do something different and something better, and a politic rooted in hope and power, not of like reform and dejection. Because for me, it's not acceptable to keep saying that we're going to throw vast amounts of our people away, because those people are my people. The caste oppressed people are the ones that are disposed of. It's Black folks that are our allies that are disposed of. And 2020 is a year where we stop being disposable and we actually just take the table over. Like we don't need to play any more of these reformist games. And the other thing that I would just say, like in terms of thinking about, you know, how we approach like a radical politic in this moment, is that we also need to have different heroes in terms of who inspire us to action. And I think when we're thinking about, you know, community safety, a great model for Kerala is Ayyankali. Ayyankali was like this badass Dalit leader who basically, you know, in the face of like unyielding, disgusting, you know, Brahminical violence, basically said, I am going to take everything back for my community. So when people would come and set fire to Dalit homes, he would set fire to their homes. And, you know, there was such a layer of intense atrocity, and he knew that we could not get justice in those systems. He set up his own separate courts and his own separate adjudicating processes. And we see a lot of the models for alternative community safety coming out of Dalit communities because we experience impunity for so many centuries. So sometimes the radical imagination in our communities, especially as we partner with Black communities, is not going to come out of upper caste people and people with wealth. It's going to come out of the people that are oppressed, because we had to figure out ways to make a way where there was none. And I think that we need to lift up that radical potential and those radical tactics right now, because what's not going to work is continuing impunity, whether it's about anti-Black violence and anti-Dalit violence. And I think there's so many opportunities for people to really get involved in whatever layer that they want. In terms of the Aid to Abolition work, that's a really critical place where people can work locally, participate in their local city council budgets, and find ways to defund the police. Particularly if you are part of a community that works with an institution that gets funding through the police allocation, you can start to have those conversations with our South Asian organizations to say, look, we got to do this another way. Let's stop meeting with the police. Let's do that. Those are the material, actual solidarities people need, not a social media card. right? Like you need to do that, you know? But the second piece I also think, like in terms of anti-Dalitness, is that there's a big case happening in the state of California where the state of California for the first time is suing Cisco for caste discrimination. And so Equality Labs will actually have a lot of calls related to that. So, you know, if you can follow us on our social media and sign up for our Instagram, we're going to need folks to help get the word out. We're going to have petitions. We're going to have campaign calls. And this is a really critical fight because it's going to be the first time that we'll be able to get a legal precedent for discrimination of caste. And, you know, we have to ask, like, why was the state of California able to do what the Indian government has failed to do for decades, right? And again, it's about the question of impunity. And so, you know, the one thing I just want to really leave people with is that if 2020 is the year that really rips the truth out of you, like my friend Sham says, it's also the year where we can show up for liberation in a way that our ancestors could never have imagined. And to use this, you know, the incredible possibility of the moment here, where we've seen so many of our structures broken down, to be the wonderful mushrooms that can actually help bring in and usher a solidarity economy that's rooted in justice and power and love and, you know, caste equity and racial equity. And, you know, we don't have to have the big picture answers if we begin with small movement experiments. And that's why I really want to encourage groups, like sometimes like in an intergenerational context, your parents might say, why are you talking about caste? Like, you don't know about anything. Like, you weren't from there. You can say, actually, I don't have to. I know that from the Equality Lab survey, you know, 1 out of 4 Dalits in the United States face physical and verbal assault. 1 out of 3 discrimination in educational environment. 2 out of 3 people who are Dalit in a workplace face workplace discrimination. You do not need to go to Kerala to make caste an issue. And if they're still fighting you on the issue, there's tons and tons of reports about caste atrocity, specifically from Kerala, whether it's Dalit rapes or atrocities and massacres. Like the complicity of that violence and why it's been so silent is an interrogation you can do with your family and the people's networks that you are connected to then really put into power the agency, the vision, and the solidarity that's required to defend Black lives. And that's really why we're all here. Like, we're here to defend Black lives, to show up to, you know, abolish the police. And when we find ourselves being uncertain or unreliable allies because of our own internal limitations, that's where we can actually take charge and do that inner work so that we can show up with power and possibility. So thank you.
Thank you, Thenmozhi. That was a brilliant call to action, and identifying the specific instances of caste discrimination that happens in the United States. But we don't really see it. Especially because what happens in the diaspora is people tend to just gravitate or even just socialize among their own caste members or among their own linguistic groups. So they don't sometimes, especially if they weren't raised in India with this awareness that caste exists, that may have just been an entire part of their life that they missed out. And I think that's primarily what we're talking to as an audience today, is there are a lot of Anglophone folk in the United States who may have not explicitly encountered caste, though it has subtly always been there. When they go to Kerala and there's caste discrimination, they may just think it's a class differential and not realize that there is a caste differential.
Well, I think one thing maybe I could like help like think about in terms of language is that there isn't actually a unified we when it comes to caste perception. That's actually the problem. Like I think everyone actually has to own their caste positionality. So I think almost what I would do is say, like, as someone with caste privilege, my networks don't allow me to see caste oppression. But I guarantee you, every single person that's caste oppressed actually already knows that they've seen it, because they're told a lot of the same things that Seema has talked about, where hide your caste, you don't know what they're gonna do, they may come for you, this might lead to sexual harassment, you know, and I think that the fact that we have such stark divisions in the diaspora and that we don't talk about it is part of caste impunity. And we take that same level of silencing and the willing to throw other communities under the bus in our approach to Black and Indigenous and other immigrant issues. It's why you have these like whole campaigns of, you know, Indians who are saying, we will help pay for your wall if you give us expedited green cards and everybody else in the immigrant rights movement, right? So there's ways that we are trained to constantly throw other members of society under the bus that is a part of our casteist training. And I think that it really begins with like, just like people say, like, I'm a non-Black POC person, you know, and a Black person versus someone who's white. People with caste privilege, and to say, wow, my space is really a caste privilege space. I know all people who are, you know, Syrian Christian, you know, and I don't know anybody else who is Dalit. Like, I'm actually Badian, you know, and I know tons of Badians, you know, I know lots of people who identify as caste oppressed, but it's not true of people who are of, you know, upper caste or dominant caste backgrounds because of how exclusive those networks are.
Exactly. And that's what I was pointing at, is that many people in dominant castes, because they only work in homogenous social networks, they may never even realize that first of all, that the caste even exists, or let alone the number of people that are left out as a result. And thank you for bringing that to light, and especially the statistics in terms of Dalit harassment and violence towards Dalits, because many Americans would not even realize that that's happening. And so thank you to the panelists. And I'm going to ask a few questions, at least the ones that I've identified with discussions around caste that people tend to bring up always. And some of them are from people who've been raised in India or live in India. And then some of them tend to be among those who were raised in the United States. So let me begin. This tends to be a common question that's brought up. Is that I lost an employment opportunity due to the reservation system back in India. I worked harder, but it was given to somebody who was Dalit-American, and that wasn't fair. And if someone was to elaborate on what the reservation system is, just so people in the United States understand, go ahead and do so, but how would you respond to that?
Who are you asking? Who are you asking?
Thenmozhi.
Oh, I mean, that's a nonsense, nothing burger argument, right? You can just basically say the same thing about affirmative action. Like when white people complain about affirmative action, there's an assumption here that if a person of color or a Dalit gets a position, that white people or upper caste people lose. And that's a zero-sum understanding of power and what's possible with community institutions. The question shouldn't be that a Dalit took my seat or a Black person took my job. It should be like, why don't we have accurate and appropriate investment in our educational institutions and in our corporations, or whatever we're looking at in that context. I think it's really comes from a violent scarcity model that also oftentimes the people that make those claims don't really acknowledge their own structural privilege. So, you know, particularly like in this context of caste, like where they have these, you know, the Ivy Leagues in India are called these schools called the Indian Institutes of India. You have all of these upper caste people that have had generational wealth and access to the best schools who go in there with this like aggressive position about how they are the kings of merit. And they use merit as a way to mask their caste capital, which then gets converted in these schools into, you know, tech capital. And the challenge of that is that, you know, the Dalits that come into those schools come in with a lot of generational paucity in terms of like how much wealth they're coming in. Maybe they haven't had access to the same resources. They can't, you know, I've known a lot of Dalit computer science engineers who went to computer science school without a computer, you know, and you're expected to compete with people who have had like, you know, thousands and thousands of dollars of investments into, you know, them being the titan of tech that they are. So it's just, I think we shouldn't let dominant caste people determine the debates. And that's part of why I'm saying that when oppressed people talk, like we define it from a place of power, not from that nothing burger place.
Thank you. And Seema or Dr. Thomas, if you want to speak on that.
Yeah, I'll just add one. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Seema.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to add one more thing to that. Oftentimes I get this from students too when I teach about caste, like when, oh, the reservation system will alleviate everything. Or if I'm talking about issues of race in the United States, I get, well, it's easier for a Black person to get into college now. And, or so Thenmozhi, when she said, they're taking my seat, I always go back with, why do you think it's your seat to begin with? That is an assumption of privilege that we need to interrogate. So for privileged communities, like Malayali Christians that I study that are Syrian Christians, we can think through some of these questions about like, whose space is this? When you say Malayali Christian, and you do not mean Dalit Christian, you only understand Malayali Christian to be Syrian Christian. These are like ways in which you can dismantle the privilege that we even talk about. Why was it your job to begin with? Why do you think it was your seat to begin with? And how is that embedded in issues of entitlement with dominant caste communities?
And I completely agree where Thenmozhi said, there are so many Dalit students who study computer science without a computer. And there's also, especially in India, there's this inherent discussion about like, did you come here out of merit? Did you come here because of your caste? And there's so much fear in getting accidentally outed because, especially when you study in engineering schools and these, Indian institutes, you're living in hostels. So you're living with the people who have dominant caste privilege over you and who are just waiting to harass you if they get to know your caste. So, first of all, you cannot be who you cannot see. So if your entire extended families for generations have never studied and haven't had education and haven't had the privilege to have jobs, it's infinitely harder for you to make that decision to even go and take up that education instead of just going with the flow and doing what the rest of the community is doing. So it's very narrow-minded, and it's Thenmozhi and Sonja already illustrated how it's wrong that they assume that the job and the seat is theirs. But, it also comes from a lack of empathy, of understanding, there's, until 2 generations ago, like, my family, women were not even allowed to cover their breasts. They didn't have the right to do that. And to come from that and, realize that nobody in your community is studying or is pursuing higher education, to take that decision itself is really hard. And when someone takes that decision and then is putting their life at risk of accidentally getting outed because of their caste in these, super dominant caste societies and education institutions, it's really, really hard. And hearing that is so painful. So even when you're asking that question, really ask yourself, what pain are you causing to that person you're asking it to?
Excellent. Thank you all for elaborating on that and the various issues that come around with even positing that question in the first place. Why would you ask that? And this entitlement many dominant caste people feel that based on quote unquote merit, they should get certain positions, and it's being taken away if it's given to someone who's Dalit Bahujan. So there's also a question I wanted to bring up that we got from one of the audience members. They ask, can you expand on how we can acknowledge our caste privilege as Syrian Christians or as dominant caste Malayalis in general, I would say? How do we discuss that with our families who often like to see their identity in this cycle? And I think this question is coming up primarily because this may be the first time, this occasion may be the first time for many families to even speak about caste in their family. So if you could enlighten us, Thenmozhi, if you want to start, and then we can go down, panelists.
Sure. I mean, I think that one of the things, just like you think about allyship with Black communities, that's a conversation you need to have in tandem with Dalit theologians and Dalit communities from Kerala, because I'm sure that they're going to have very specific demands of the Syrian Christian community. Like, for example, there was an event, there was a very highly popularized post of someone who was from the Syrian Christian community who basically said that she was leaving the church because the church hosted Modi, right? And so I think that there are practical things about how there might be reform possibilities, how the Syrian Christian community may be seen as a reformist or even outright antagonist of Dalit communities' interest in those areas. And I think talking with Dalits who are from Kerala, who can speak to that, is a big first step. But I also think that there are other ways to kind of look at this conversation, which are about, you know, what are the ways that we promote elitism when we tell the story of Syrian Christians being Brahmin converts? I mean, that there's nothing exciting about that, except for the fact that that sets up Syrian Christians to be in a position of privilege compared to other Christian faiths in the state. And that has actually led to a lot of dynamics because, you know, a lot of people will say in caste oppressed communities, well, Syrian Christians are actually Brahmin, you know? So they're, you know, and the way that they have approached and dealt with that. So I actually think, one, you need to be more in communication with Dalits that are from Kerala that can speak to like what the demands are. But also in the United States, there are actually a lot of caste oppressed people from Kerala, but they don't come to very dominantly Syrian Christian spaces because of the way caste is not talked about. And so I think it also means radically changing the leadership of our institutions so that you have caste oppressed people in positions with equity to start to name and talk about what their issues are, whether they're, you know, Kerala Muslims, like Mapala Muslims, or, you know, again, like people that are from these different movements. But it's a tough conversation to have with your family, particularly if they're really resistant to even acknowledging caste doesn't exist, because the hard part is that when you are Christian, whether you're Syrian or a caste oppressed Christian, you face the blow of Hindu nationalism. And so I think a lot of Syrian Christians lean into the violence of being persecuted as a Christian, but not making the next step to saying, like, where are we perpetuating casteist divides intentionally or unintentionally, right? So I think it's about starting to have a very rigorous curiosity about where is caste showing up, you know, and usually it's all in the places that Seema mentioned. Who do you marry? Who is seen as a good coming from a good family? Who are the leaders and who is said not to be a good leader? Where does money and power get broken up to? Where are you not allowed to engage with? Those are the things that often tell you the good indicators for this.
Thank you. And Seema, if you want to say something about it, or
I think for me, like Thenmozhi said, it's, you know, really talking to the Dalit communities and like understanding what their demands are. But from my side, from a personal side, it's just about, you know, if you are really interacting, you know, if you're throwing something that's Indian, but only interacting with, only inviting your own community, because, you know, a lot of people who migrate like me are isolated and are in search of a community, but we are excluded from all these places because everyone's just focused on their own community, right? So it's really hard for me to find solidarity or community in, you know, these cities that I'm living in, especially if I want to connect with fellow Indians. So just realizing, you know, obviously there's places for you to, you know, not invite me to your church or something like that, but you should really think about, you know, whose perspectives are you really considering in your life. And there are other ways in which casteism is perpetuated, which is through, like, you know, very strict practices around arranged marriage and very strict, you know, rules for girls to not go out in the sun and like not get dark skin because they'll be assumed to be from a darker caste. So just those really subtle ways that we have internalized casteism, really questioning that, and having discussions around it. Like the best thing that I've used to talk to my parents about anything is questions, like really questioning their assumptions about, you know, why should we hide this? Why should we not take up space? What is the reason behind that? And just really getting them to, you know, verbalize their thought process. And usually that ends in a place where if they're questioning themselves in the right way, they reach the conclusion themselves. And that's really, you know, that's really the win for me, instead of me having to, you know, continuously push something on them. So that's what's been helpful for me. And I think that's, from a personal angle, if, these spaces were more inclusive, especially when it's a point of celebration or a point of, like Thenmozhi said, if you're celebrating art or you're showcasing, a panel on success or any of those things, really think about, who are you including in these spaces? Is just people just who are like you and you're perpetuating then your caste privilege because of that? Or are you intentionally going out and being inclusive and finding people who have done, great work from other castes?
Great. And Dr. Thomas, if you want to comment on that?
Only to reiterate some of the things that have already been said, and maybe just to also talk about some of the language that we use in the privileged enclaves in which we Syrian Christians might live in. So I think a lot of second generation have been asking me, like, these conversations are difficult. And I think I went and got a PhD in women's studies and asked these questions to my parents earlier on to confront the fact that Syrian Christians were slave owners. We have this history, but when you do a church history, you might just only read about Syrian Christians were Brahmin, and then you read about, like, I don't know, maybe the Kunin Kudusha, right? Like, so you'll read about these things that really celebrate the history. But like Thenmozhi said, so much of what we understand to be history is written by dominant caste peoples. If you look at all the research that's done on on Indian Christians in the United States, implicitly they focus on Syrian Christians, right? So to ask those questions, where is the history? If I know that the histories that I'm reading are written predominantly by dominant caste peoples, and I know that the Syrian Christians are a dominant caste community, then we need to interrogate that which we consider history from the very beginning. We need to, interrogate the language. And there's going to be a lot of caste fragility, because I just talked to a Malayali Christian church where, some of the young people were saying, like, I was told that we don't have caste. And I was told that Kerala is really educated. So just ask a question, if you ever visit Kerala, or if you ever had the privilege to be mobile. Syrian Christians are the largest landowners in Kerala. They lead all other religious groups in land ownership. Do you own land, or do you work the land? Just ask that simple question. And you might get a lot of pushback from people who don't want to talk about caste privilege, because caste fragility is fierce. They'll have anger, argumentation. It doesn't exist anymore. We have reservations. It went away. We're educated. But that doesn't mean that the conversations can't happen or shouldn't be happening. They should be happening within caste privilege enclaves. And we can question the very language that we use. I've been bringing up the fact that we will call the Syrian Christian churches by their church names. We will call them Syro-Malabar, Martoma. But when we talk about a Dalit Christian, we will use the caste name and say Pulayan Christian. Even the language in which Malayalees use to talk about Christianity can cause us to actually ask those questions. Whether or not they're hard questions is then another matter, because if we're not going to ask the hard questions, then you're not really for Dalit lives. It's about making that commitment to do it, and then questioning our histories and questioning that which we've been told, questioning the very language that we use.
Excellent. And thank you for elaborating how these communities can be more vocal about it, especially dominant caste communities where this is heavily silenced or ignored, or there's a culture of ignorance that is cultivated by parents never mentioning it or being embarrassed to mention it. Another question that we fielded, and I had a suspicion this question would come up, is that especially with Black Lives Matter being such a large movement, many people are emphasizing centering Black voices, and some may critique this as like, well, if you're talking about caste, especially as it relates in the South Asian context, it doesn't really seem to be focusing on Black American voices. And then some may also say, and this was a question someone asked, is I'm still not seeing the direct parallel between casteism and anti-Blackness. Can you expand on how our practice of anti-Blackness in America is related to our privilege back in India? So again, Thenmozhi, if you want to comment on that or elaborate on that.
I mean, can you hear me? Okay. I mean, I think that this is where people really need to do their own work. You know what I mean? Like, there's a great talk that we had with Professor Cornell West, and the Shidi community and Chandrasekhar Azad, which I think can actually help lay some context. But in the context of impunity, South Asian communities are deeply complicit with the murder and atrocity of Dalit lives for centuries. We are like the Afrikaners as a community who have gone to a diaspora and nicely become settler colonials and have treated Black and Indigenous people very poorly because we have been trained to be assholes to hundreds of millions of caste oppressed people. That's as clear as I can make it. We don't even acknowledge our own Black diaspora in South Asia. You know, that's what I'm talking about, is that the reason why, like, I'm here as someone who is deeply connected to material support for Black liberation. I work with organizers all the time. I've had relationships with Black leaders for many years, and I'm here for Black liberation right now in this moment. And there are tons of things that I do that are public and that are private about that. And it's not a focus for me in terms of the United States to decenter Black liberation. What I'm doing, though, is I'm talking about the same frustration I've had about the reformist upper caste communities who tell us that caste doesn't exist are actually the same people that throw Black people under the bus. And that's why I'm saying anti-Dalitness informs our anti-Blackness. We've seen it in South Asia. Before we set foot, and crossed the Kalapani and came into wherever part of the diaspora, we were already massively anti-Black. We already erased so many of the histories of Indians being slave owners of Black people because it was normalized to be, slave owners of Dalit peoples. That's literally the history in South Asia. So I think that's the fact that question keeps coming up has to do a lot with caste fragility and race fragility, because it's much easier to lean into either white adjacency with white people or to sit in the place of like superficial understandings of race where it's like, yes, I experienced racism. It's actually all about me. And the reality is that we become reformist roadblocks when we sit in our own experience and make conversations of race be all about South Asian experiences with appropriation and colorism. Nobody cares if that one rock star is wearing a freaking bindi when Black people are being, shot in the streets, right? The challenge here is for people to go deeper with their analysis, to get structural, and to lean into the parts where they're deeply uncomfortable, because those are the edge cases of your privilege. And everyone has privilege, whatever that looks like. But when you lean into that, you actually illuminate the pathway to growth that leads to co-liberation. And that's why I'm saying, let 2020 be the year that rips the truth out of you. Go into the places that you didn't go before that were limited by your ego and limited by your sense of needing to protect yourself in such violent capitalistic systems, and the only thing that you'll gain is actually illumination and a movement that builds power, as opposed to reformist policies that free no one but trap everybody.
Yeah, I completely agree. And for me, like I said, I know firsthand that if you, like Thenmozhi said, if you transport somebody from India without teaching them anything about race, without teaching them anything, like keep them in that vacuum and then transport them here, they are by default anti-Black because of the way that we've been raised in casteist and colorist societies. So I think that, the reason I'm talking about this and the reason I try to start these conversations is because these people are silent. The same people who are, denying these problems, they are silent and they are not doing anything. And I think there's a bigger possibility of them listening to me than them listening to Black people. So I'm trying to use that opportunity to be like, listen, I'm knocking on your door. I'm telling you there's a problem. You need to confront these issues that, are sitting at your doorstep and inside your homes. And, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt that maybe they don't realize this is a problem, but, like we know already, there are a lot of people who know this is a problem and they choose willfully to ignore it. So it's just about organizing for me and, just making sure that, if these people are not going to listen to Black people, at least I can bring some cases to them and bring some data to them to show them that, you are complicit and you are perpetuating anti-Blackness in so many ways. And, for me, it's also like Thenmozhi said, it also ties back to, how people are funding, Modi's re-election and things like that. So if I don't make noise about that here, it's still, the majority of that funding is still coming from America and still coming from our communities. And if we don't stop that, we allow these systems to perpetuate. And so for me, it's just been like, I know that we should be centering Black voices, but I'm trying to use whatever little opportunity I have to, knock down those doors of the people who are, not even ready to open their homes to these conversations. So just having that conversations and organizing people to, educate these people who, deny these problems always.
Thank you. Dr. Thomas, if you wanted to comment on that.
Just reiterate what everybody has said. We need to take a deeper dive. And when we say this easy call out that like, oh, we're taking away from Black lives, we allied an entire history of Dalit and Black struggles that are solidarity struggles between anti-racism and anti-casteism, right? And then we also kind of say like, it's kind of this holier than thou politic that I've now said something, but we haven't done what Thenmozhi was saying. We haven't dismantled the structures. We haven't dismantled the structures of racialized discrimination against Dravidian and Dalit Bahujans in India or in the diaspora, right? So we can understand the pernicious nature of anti-Blackness in South Asian communities in the United States so much more if we take a deeper dive to understand how those structures are already set up, because India and the diaspora is so casteist, and that needs to be something that we do that deeper dive into.
And like Thenmozhi said, it all starts with internal reflection. And for us in the Indian diaspora, that's where the reflection should start, is understanding like the ways that we've perpetuated so many systems of oppression. And it begins with, really understanding how we've internalized caste system. And unless we have that discussion, we're going to keep participating in these systems.
Thank you. And what I really liked about this was many of you demanded a radical call to action. And not denying the ways in which we're complicit back in India and also among the diaspora here in the ways we're casteist, and how that informs our anti-Blackness for many South Asians over here, and the ease with which that framework or mental framework can be translated over to perpetuate anti-Blackness against the Black community. So for those who are wondering where that connection can be made, I think our panelists have elaborated many facets of that and the importance as to why we should be concerned about Dalit Bahujan lives alongside Black American lives. And then I actually wanted to go to something, Seema, you pointed out specifically about how South Asians here support the Modi government, and there's like a political channel in terms of money as it travels back. If you want to speak about how the diaspora may be complicit in many ways of marginalizing Dalit Bahujan lives while living in the United States and also being anti-Black, I'd like to hear about that.
So I actually didn't know about, how strong Modi's, funding was in America until very recently, when I started being so vocal about Modi. And I realized that, the local grocery store, most of those grocery stores, the founders of those grocery stores are actually funding Modi. And, when I tried to organize a rally against CA and NRC, we were trying to have it in Artesia, and a lot of people brought up like, a lot of people who own stores in Artesia, which is the predominantly Indian neighborhood near LA, they are all Modi supporters. So we might actually face a lot of pushback and things like that. So it was a wake up call for me to realize the extent of that. How do I even talk about Modi? It's so frustrating to me. I don't understand how people who claim to be liberal and sit in California and claim to reap the benefits of liberalism and pro-immigrant policies can then go on and support Modi. It's so disheartening to me. A lot of times, I see that people here are not even educated about the problems that are happening in India. They didn't know about the genocide that was happening in India recently, and so I just had to step in and be like, listen, nobody's talking about this, so I have to tell you, like, it seems like people in my circle itself don't know what is happening in India. And a lot of times, you just hear like whitewashed versions of this story, and only when it's, you know, picked up by New York Times or like Washington Post or something, it comes to people's attention. So I really want to question people who are still in the bucket for, you know, supporting Modi right now. I honestly can't even take them seriously if they want to do this work and then support Modi. But really just questioning like how you can support a leader like that who's committing genocide by the day, who has you know, disenfranchised Muslims from day one. He keeps doing these theatrics and like, you know, PR moves to show that he's, you know, he's himself from a low caste, and all the systems that he has put in place are intentionally to disenfranchise Muslims and the Dalit Bahujans. So I would really implore everyone who supports him to think about, like, you know, if you are here, you are basically pro-immigrant because you arrived in a new country. And if you apply that same lens to Modi, he's the most anti-immigrant. He's basically establishing systems like ICE and, you know, detention centers in India right now because of, like, he must have heard about how this complex is super profitable from Trump. And they're, you know, so if you are here, you have benefited from the civil rights movement, you've benefited from immigration reform, you stand for those politics, you are the product of those politics. And then you should apply that same lens to, you know, Indian politics and really apply that same lens to Modi as well. But yeah, I get really worked up when I talk about Modi, so I'm going to let Thenmozhi and Sonja talk.
Of course, thank you. Thenmozhi, if you want to comment on that, the way the diaspora is complicit.
I mean, the fighting against Hindu nationalism for me is like a core part of the work that I've done in my work as an organizer and in the work that we do at Equality Labs, and also the Alliance for Justice and Accountability, because, you know, the networks of Hindu nationalism are the networks of caste privilege in the US. And what they're trying to do is use their caste capital, again, to put money and soft diplomatic support to push a nationalist agenda in India. And the diaspora has, like, at their, you know, has a huge role of complicity to play, because there was technologists, there was donors, and there was cultural ambassadors that all helped the rise to Modi. And we have a debt to pay. A debt is owed because of that decision and the unchecked Brahmanism in the diaspora. We have now seen the largest democracy in the world brought to the precipice of genocide. And it is in fact in a stage of genocide. And with the Citizenship Amendment Act, Modi and the BJP have basically sentenced hundreds of millions of Muslims and caste oppressed people and the poor to the largest statelessness crisis in world history. And if you want to kind of compare the numbers, like, you know, it took 1 million people to be denaturalized in the Rohingya Myanmar genocide, and 1 million that were impacted in Rwanda. We already have 2 million who are impacted in the Northeast, and they haven't even they've already begun building other camps like all across India. So I think, you know, history is going to ask, like, what were you doing when India started its genocidal project? And are you going to tell people who ask for your accountability that you were not willing to read, that you were not willing to show up when hundreds of millions of lives were in the balance? Like, this is our Holocaust. This is our moment where the Nazis aren't Germans in fucking Europe. They're actually upper caste Indians. And that's what people really need to reconcile with. Like, we are not the innocent people who are here showing up as allies, as fellow oppressed people. Upper caste networks have allowed a genocide to occur on their watch and have been reformist roadblocks to institutions of policing and violence. And, you know, it's outrageous. And I think we've always seen Dalit women at the forefront to these fights, because we have to fight, because it's our communities, our bodies on the line right now. But that burden doesn't need to be ours anymore. It's really time to disrupt every single space where Hindu nationalists comes into play. And I'm speaking specifically because the Syrian church has platformed Hindu nationalists, actually at the opposition of other Christians across India. You know, this is a time, you know, in this period where Hindu nationalists have burned churches, raped nuns, destroyed Christian hospitals. So it's ridiculous to have one of the most powerful Indian churches platform Modi. So where's the accountability in that, guys? You need to disrupt every single situation that occurs. Like, you need to look back and say how the Modi happened in October of last year. How many Syrian churches and Syrian Christians were part of that? Where is the accountability process in that? Because they will use every Christian and Sikh and Jain person that shares their platform and weaponize that against Indian Muslims and caste oppressed people. Because again, upper caste people showed up as reformist roadblocks at the expense of Dalit Bahujan lives. And I think that's really this moment right now, that we have these many, many battles. Like, and if you think about what we've endured as a South Asian community, you know, we started the year with the genocide, got into a pandemic, and now we're in a police uprising, you know, an uprising for Black liberation. And we all have different roles to play around our accountability and complicity and solidarity. But we can't do that if we're not talking real talk, right? And the real talk that we need to be talking about is like, we have a lot of ish that we created. We have a lot of ish that we're super complicit with. And it's not enough for someone to be going on and on and on about like superficial appropriation shit when genocide is happening in our watch. Think about how many influencers that people here follow. And I'm even thinking about like Mindy Kaling's show. Like, how do you have a show that comes out about Indian American reality in 2020 and you have something that props up Modi at a time when it's a fucking genocide, right? There's nothing more tone deaf than that, right? You don't get, you know, we have to come up for a term about like what an Indian Karen is, but that's like a Karen ass move right there, you know? And maybe that's like a Priya move is what we need to call it, you know? I don't know what it is, but what I'm telling you right now, it is not okay in 2021. And I need everybody out there to disrupt every single space, because honestly, those of us have been on the front lines who've already lost people. Like, we have better jobs to do. You know what we need to do? We need to be building the future. We need to be thinking about what does an intercaste and interfaith society look like? And to do that, we need other people to clear the way of their messy casteist and reformist relatives who are actually causing all of these problems. And I think one of the things in, you know, doing our unlearning caste supremacy workshops that we do, so much of the discomfort of talking about caste has to do with the fact of people being uncomfortable disrupting family sessions. You know, they're like, I would bring it up, but then like someone might get mad at me in my WhatsApp group, or, oh my God, you know, the dinner would be, I would just say, forget all of that. You know, there's gonna be lots of egg curry on the floor and puttu thrown around. That's okay. You know, WhatsApp groups may have a lot of hurt feelings, but the hurt feelings are way more preferable than Black and Dalit deaths. They are way more preferable than a genocide. And you cannot let your discomfort as an upper caste or dominant caste person get in the way of the preservation of life. Because that's actually been the way that this conversation has been determined by caste privileged people. And I just think it's enough. We just don't need to do that anymore. Like, 2021 is something different, you know? Your discomfort doesn't get to determine the terms of liberation. And so if we're going to really change, let's just change it all the way. Let's go all the way to the end, you know, because I'm not trying to be here doing like truth and reconciliation sessions after a genocide has happened because you were lazy and you didn't want to address your discomfort. Like, at this point, our bodies have to go on the line to stop a genocide because we have to answer to the children that aren't here because we didn't do that work. So that's why you need to show up, and you need to show up hard.
Thank you so much. That's brilliantly said. And I think you brought up an excellent point, which seems paradoxical, is that Syrian Christians are in many ways complicit and actively involved in maintaining the Modi government at the stake of Dalit Bahujan lives and Muslim lives in the US. And to clarify for any of our listeners, which genocide Thenmozhi was referring to is there in Northeast India. There was a Citizenship Reformation Act that was instilled, which leaves a lot of people there who lived on Indian soil stateless. And it's an active effort to exclude primarily Muslim lives from that region. And the Indian government is complicit in that. And it started earlier this year, but in the speed of the pandemic, the import of it has been undermined. And then Dr. Thomas, if you want to speak a bit more about the Syrian Christians' involvement in that.
I can't say any better than Thenmozhi just said. I will say just an added thing to that is that the Syrian Christians, the clergy have been so friendly with Modi. And when they meet with them, they often talk about rubber because Kerala is the fourth largest, India is the fourth largest exporter of natural rubber in the whole world. And 90% of that rubber cultivation comes from Kerala. And Syrian Christians have a virtual monopoly on that, right? So they meet to talk about the plummeting rubber prices. So you can see here how dominant caste alliances between Hindus and the Syrian Christians happen along the ways in which they want to protect their class interests, right? And so Dalit laboring bodies, Dalit Bahujan laboring bodies are integral to keeping that caste class privilege across religions, across dominant caste Hindus and dominant caste Syrian Christians. So, you know, to recognize that. And I'll say one more thing too, like about the, you know, when something like the cow preservation bills were going on, I saw a lot of buzz from Kerala peoples just in general, all religions, saying like, you know, we eat beef all the time. There's no problem here. It's other parts of India that have that problem, right? Without really even talking about the fact that Syrian Christians will never go to a Dalit Bahujan house to share food to this day, right? So we act like Kerala is caste exceptional when it comes to beef eating without really contextualizing the casteism within the Syrian Christian community that happens on a day-to-day basis with so many caste practices.
Excellent, thank you. And I had one final question. This is directed towards Thenmozhi. I see your background right there, and you've spoken about it at previous talks. If you want to elaborate the significance of it for the viewers who've been seeing that in your background, I think they would appreciate it.
This is a piece of art that is called like Amma and Amachi. And it's, you know, it's a piece of art that is really exploring like what it means to kind of liberate our aesthetics as Dalit women across time and across history. And, you know, we're not a community that's actually been, you know, as women, we're not, you know, we're framed both by Brahminical texts, you know, which is like the text behind her, but also by the English gaze. And, you know, what was so interesting was that the laws of South Asian past were actually made on copper plates. So I did this whole printed collage on a copper plate because I wanted to make our own law as Dalit feminisms to be able to create our own radical futures. And you know, it's an example of a lot of my work and my thinking is that, you know, in some ways like Dalit futurist aesthetics are all about liberating ourselves from the Brahminical gaze and the Brahminical positionalities that put us either as subjects with a begging bowl or as bodies to be exploited. And, you know, I was really thinking about that in listening to Seema talk because, you know, I think that there's a lot of viewers who are dominant caste who could really find community with Seema in terms of how she speaks to colorism. But I also really want to encourage people to think about the radicalness of what it means for a Dalit Bahujan woman from Kerala to be talking about femininity and beauty and positionality in a state where Dalit women were taxed with a breast tax in order if we were to cover our breasts. So the sexual violence was actually baked into the actual Brahminical law. And Nangali was this very powerful woman who said, fuck this, cut off her breasts and put it on a plantain leaf to the tax collector and said, you know, that was like her big fuck you. And, you know, she died. Obviously, you can't cut off your breasts. But I think the story of that was really actually about her resistance to like not wanting to have her body policed by caste, Brahminical patriarchy. And her husband, after her death, immolated himself in one of the only known cases of male sati, and I think this is what changes, like when, Dalit women, are centered, and when we tell our stories, we tell them in a way that not just frees ourselves, but frees everybody. And, I also think of Seema's work in the context of P.K. Rosie, one of the first, actresses, and also a Dalit, Bahujan woman, who was in one of the first, Malayali films. And she played someone who was not Dalit. She was playing someone who was from dominant caste. And she first wasn't allowed into the theater. And then when she was in the theater and people were watching the film with her in it, the dominant caste were so upset, they set fire to the theater space, and then chased her out, and then she had to leave, and she went into ignominy. And I think that's why I think, people shouldn't take for granted the ease of access you have to caste oppressed women, like you have in a session like this, because there was many bodies and a lot of blood and a lot of shame and a lot of sexual violence that prevented us from being here earlier. But now that we're here, we get to take the whole table. And the table is going to be ours for a long time to come. And structurally, the ways we look at these issues of representation and beauty and aesthetics, we now need to understand that we have seen them through a lens primarily of the oppressor's voice. And so, as more caste oppressed people take up space, we're going to be experimenting, and sometimes we'll be really good at it, and sometimes we'll be really shitty at it, because guess what? We've had only 40 years of reservation or affirmative action, whereas other communities have thousands of years of privilege, right? So the ability for us to find our own vibe and relish in our own beauty and joy, that's what we're going to be doing. And that's what our radical Dalit futures are going to look like. And our radical Dalit futures are going to include a vision of caste equity and gender equity that has never been seen before. Because if you can protect Dalit women, you protect a lot of motherfucking people. Because you have to have a society that addresses caste-based sexual violence and and that really confronts the structure of impunity that allow for massive amounts of rape on Dalit women's body. And, this piece of work to me was really that testament about so much of my work is rooted in ancestral power, As someone who was Parian, my caste was formed in the 13th century. And I think about how much violence my foremothers faced and how little, hope they had for dignity or for possibility. But what they had was an incredible sense of love and a sense of power. And I just always think about, I don't know if your moms ever do that oiling thing where they're pressing oil into your flesh or your hair, and that act of love of them actually pressing love into you. That's what my ancestors did. They may not have had freedom, but they wished one day for a daughter to be free. And now that I'm here, I'm gonna fucking take it all. And I'm gonna bring everybody else around with me, because we don't need this crap of anti-Dalitness and anti-Blackness. What we need is a world where we are all co-liberated together. And that's a big part of my my artwork and the vision I have for creativity, because we can't just be invested in blocking strategies that are about preventing harm. We have to also dream. And this is a time with so many nightmares that the possibility for us to dream is actually how we're going to birth the future where we're all free. And so that's for me a lot of my arts practice.
Thank you so much. And I think on that note, thinking about futurity and re-envisioning futurity, especially through a radical politics and through radical action, we can see how anti-Blackness is closely related to the Dalit Bahujan movement, and how South Asians, both in the diaspora and living in South Asia, are connected through that. So there are people asking for literature and direction towards literature and resources. Is that something you would want to answer right now, or something we can post on the event page after this? And it goes to any of the panelists who are doing work on this front.
I would say for folks that want to learn about caste in the diaspora, they should come to Equality Labs' social media and read our caste survey. That's a great primer to understanding caste, really basically understanding the history of caste as well as the data around it. I also recommend you read Dr. Ambedkar. He's really great, as well as, you know, I would really look up the histories of Iyengali, Nangali, and PK Rosie. Those are all really powerful stories to learn about and build around. And also, like, you know, there's actually, if you just look up Dalits in Kerala, there's actually tons of things to read about. And I would suggest you get in a collective reading group and work through some of those questions and issues that are coming out for people, because this is that time.
Excellent. And Seema Hari mentioned that she'll send us some resources and we'll put it up on the page. And then Dr. Thomas, if you wanted to recommend anything.
I can send a lot of resources on the page, but I would also recommend all Malayalees read Sanal Mohan's work, who's phenomenal, who's written a book called The Modernity of Slavery that will give you the history of Dalit slave caste peoples and issues of Dalit activism and organizing, but also especially for I know we have a lot of Syrian Christians on this group, to think through issues of Dalit Christian activism. And he's written a lot about issues of prayer in Dalit Christian communities that I can provide a lot of resources for.
Excellent. And with that, I'd like to thank all our panelists for a brilliant panel that enlightened us both on anti-Blackness and its strong relation to casteism, both in South Asia and in the diaspora. Thank you all for being here. It was a privilege listening to you and the information that you shared with us and the new insights that you brought to a community that was generally silent about this for a long time, but got this opportunity to listen to you and learn from it. So with that, I'd like to end this, and thank you to our listeners. We will post more resources on the Malayalees for Black Lives Matter and create a resource site that will direct you to all the things that were mentioned in the video so far. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.